My name is Louise Arbour. I'm the President and CEO of International Crisis Group. We published last week a report entitled War Crimes in Sri Lanka. In that report, we documented very serious allegations regarding the perpetration of war crimes, both by the LTTE and by the government forces in the last 5 months of the brutal war that opposed the government to these Tamil Tigers over a period of decades. The last few months of the war were particularly brutal and characterized by crimes perpetrated by both sides of the conflict on civilian populations. We've accumulated credible evidence, certainly sufficient to give reasonable grounds to believe that these crimes were perpetrated with the consent of the highest authorities responsible under the chain of command. These violations of international humanitarian law, the laws and customs of war applicable to all nations, included the deliberate shelling of civilians, of hospitals, clearly in contravention of international law, and the targeting, which appears to be very deliberate, of humanitarian operations. On the basis of the evidence that we've accumulated and of the also evidence that other NGOs and some of the international media have been able to accumulate, we have called for an international inquiry to examine what happened in these last few months of the war, to determine the number of civilian casualties, and to examine in particular the mechanisms of accountability that should be put in place if indeed war crimes have been perpetrated as the evidence suggests. Since we released the report, there's been enormous public interest, media interest. There's been a lot of support, certainly for our call for a further credible, transparent international investigation. The government of Sri Lanka and supporters of the governments have, not surprisingly, taken issue with everything except the substance of our allegations, with the timing of our publication, imputing all kinds of sinister motives to our report. There has yet to be a serious engagement or credible rebuttal of any of the substantive allegations that are contained in the report. Very surprisingly, the government is resisting terribly the idea of an international investigation, purportedly on the basis that this amounts to a form of neo-colonialism. Hardly, I would suggest, a persuasive argument to ensure that a credible narrative is put out both for the people of Sri Lanka and for the international community, documenting what happened in this very dark chapter of their history. This is not only important to ensure that the long-standing culture of impunity in Sri Lanka is reversed, but also to ensure that, in particular, the Tamil population, but the whole population of Sri Lanka, understands and believes the extent to which the Tamil Tigers preyed on their own people in these last few months of the war. The narrative put out by the government will never be a credible one, particularly if it continues to prove unable and unwilling to examine its own responsibility.